Chihiro is Bolivian-Dutch with Quechua and ancestry and born and raised in Amsterdam. She works as a multidisciplinary artist, writer, organizer, trainer with a vision to restore and restore our relationship with Earth and each other. She's known for training and speaking on decolonization, Indigenous rights, climate justice, climate racism, art and activism, and rights for Earth. Also reparations, community organizing, different visual and artistic productions and editing work. So yeah, it's gonna be exciting. Our session will or this workshop will take around 2 hours. And the first 30 minutes, around 30 minutes, will be an introductory presentation where Chihiro will reflect on some historical and conceptual tensions that lie between different people working on environmental rights. And there will be particular attention will be given to Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizational differences. We'll have a practical assignment and questions following that. In the middle of everything, we'll have a 5-minute break where you can also go to the bathroom or get a tea or something. And can continue thinking your thoughts for later on, and then we'll have another assignment if I got that right. And at the end, of course, we'll have some time to reflect and discuss what we've taken out of the assignments and the workshop elements. Yeah, and with that, I'm going to pass it over to Chihiro. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. It's so lovely to join you, and thank you for inviting me to all the lovely organizers. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So happy to be with you today. I will start by sharing a little bit of my own activist journey, which started with the struggle for rights for Mother Earth. In any talk that I do, colonialism and colonial violence plays a role. And so I don't want to assume that people are numb and desensitized, which often we do. So I actually want to trigger warn, not to use history to shock or to be hurtful, but more to invite people to be in their body and to stay with their body and to stay with their gut. As we shall talk about later, the gut is actually our own inner forest or the inner deforestation that is happening through environmental harm. We have a whole landscape of beings inside of ourselves. So staying with the gut is, my invitation to see if it hurts, if something needs attention, if something needs aftercare. I hope we can all be here as not numb people. So that's just an invite. So hi, my name is Chihiro Geuzebroek, and my activist journey started around 2003 against the war or invasion in Iraq. And then activism turned into organizing when I learned about Bolivia proposing rights for Mother Earth at climate summits in 2009. When I was at the UN Climate Summit in Copenhagen. And so this idea of rights for Mother Earth and a tribunal for crimes against Earth was really sparking a particular point in my spirit where I felt like I need to go to Bolivia, I need to learn more, I need to be able to embody this or bring this into being here in the Netherlands. And yeah, it put me on a journey. I made a film in Bolivia, which was really about rights for Mother Earth and how, as a little activist, not knowing how to do collective change when you're still socialized into being an individual, how to move that forward, such a big task, such a monumental system change. So I'll reflect a little bit on how it came to be that from this huge passion, making a movie for 4 years about the struggle for rights for Mother Earth, it has faded in my activism more and more away. And now when people talk about rights for nature, I'm like, oh yeah, that's also happening. And getting invited to this talk, I really did a lot of reflection work. Like, what is it? Where are the bumps that I got demotivated, or where did I see ruptures with certain Indigenous organizing? And I hope this will be helpful for everyone in their activist journey. And yeah, let's go. I think one of the first things is to reflect on the film I made in Bolivia. It's called Radical Friends. And that started with looking at the history of Bolivia, which is very rich in revolutions. It has over 100 revolutions. And one of the prominent revolutions is the water war, where people were rising up against the privatization of water. So it was the Water is Life movement before Standing Rock in 2000. And people were shot at. A boy who was 17 died. Here you see me visiting his grave with an activist in Bolivia. But what was very clear was that this struggle was both for the people as asserting the inherent right of water, as it was against this colonial idea of private property, that the water, which is a being, can be private property. That's just not compatible. And looking into the Bolivian history even more, especially like, why is this a country that got to be such a prominent player in the UN climate summits to advocate for rights for Earth? I learned more about Potosi, which is the mountain of silver that for 250 years, or 265 years to be precise, was like, I think, oh, now I have to say it correctly. I want to say 20% of the world silver, but at least a very large chunk of global silver came from this one Cerro Rico in Potosi. This is where my grandmother's from. And you have a Casa de Moneda. It's a house where they turned the silver into money. And this is the type of art where you see that Pachamama is no longer a being of itself, but it's kind of subjugated to Christianity and this ladder of being with God on top and the earth as the dominion for the taking, to be a possession, actually, this colonial development. And I think very early on in my activism, I learned about the great chain of being. It's the ladder that we see on the right in black and white, and it has God on top, then angel, heaven, human, beast, plant, flame, stone, and then finally in the bottom is minerals. And there are some different critiques of like how enlightenment only got rid of God and angels and the heaven and just put humans on top and kept the ladder intact. Only now it was not because of divinity, but it was because we had supreme intellect. And what does grass know, or what does a meadow know? It was proposed as less knowledgeable. So this great chain of being is not compatible with indigenous way of life, where the land is not property, but it's actually the being to which we belong. So it's a reverse understanding of who we owe our sensitivity, our labor, our integrity to, with the land being the thing that doesn't grow. So if we want to develop, we don't develop through accumulation of goods, but we develop our relationship with the land so that the relationship is good. And so we see through colonialism that this relationship has actually been disturbed and created a relationship of death and destruction, both of the people. It is said that 8 million people died in the mines of Potosi. Even if this is less, it is a lot. and also of animals. There was a whole production that was started from Europe to, from the second boat of Columbus. It brought animals to the New World, so-called New World, Abya Yala, to bring donkeys all the way to Argentina, then all the way to Bolivia. And when they arrived in this Casa de Moneda, where you see this kind of factory wheel to turn the silver into coins, the donkeys died within 3 months. So you have this whole system of death, of labor, of death, of exploitation of the land. And for me, this was a very wholesome historical part of the rights for Mother Earth, and also that the earth is not nature, it is our mother. Nature is this thing that enlightenment came up with. I'll talk about that more later. So this is how, for me, there was a very early understanding how colonialism itself is the existential crisis, is eroding our relationship with the land and each other, with all our relations, as we say. So this goes back in, like, this could be a talk on colonialism and the fossil fuels, of deforestation, of agribusiness, of military. They all have their history of colonialism and it disrupting the relationship with Mother Earth. But this is not that talk. Just to underline the decolonial element before we dive in. Next slide, please. So here we see old growth forest and unceded land in green in a timeline. We see as the land is keep getting invaded, this is the US, old growth forest is just there, and then there's just the land. So we see this erosion of land taking place. This is just one element of colonialism in a map. Next slide, please. Another element is the sixth extinction. Over 150,000 species vanished in the last 500 years. What happened in the last 500 years? Or the colonization through food. So as I mentioned, Columbus, from the second ship on, when he came to the New World, there were animals on the ships. And that's because there were racist ideas about food. There were classist ideas about food as well in Spain. So the rich would not eat from the ground. They wouldn't eat the carrots or something. They would eat the bread and the wine and the meat, which was literally more elevated. And they also had the idea that if they would eat the food of the indigenous people, they would turn into them, that they would change race. So they brought their own cattle, like cows and whatnot. And as you can see, this is a map of today, like mass cows and meat industry in Latin America, and it's causing huge environmental impact. So it's another colonial story. Next slide, please. Here we see extracting Africa's gemstones and minerals. And this is as much of a story of back then as it is right now. We all know the mining that happens in Congo right now or in other places. This front line has been created as a dispossession place. And here it's important to underline again the wholesomeness of the oppression of earth and of earthlings, and not to separate it, both in the rights for earth and as the rights for humans. It's a very Western frame. Next slide, please. And to drive it home, because often we only talk about these things abroad, but this is a little image of 2022. How much land do we consume, both through carbon use of emissions, as well as dumping waste. The Netherlands uses 7.3 times its land land base. So we overshoot 7.3. That means that we're assuming to invade or abuse some other lands that are not Netherlands. And we also see a message of, you are poor. If you buy me this hill and your lake, you will get money. And the people say, well, when the money finishes, I won't have a hill or a lake. And then the people of the company say, oh, how stupid are you? How primitive you are, you ignorant. So this is a familiar conversation that we see in industry, that somehow people should just, move over for money. Next slide, please. So coming back from making my movie on rights for Mother Earth with a decolonial lens, seeing the picture of different harms, I came back to the Netherlands, and most of it was like cheerful activism of saving the polar bear, saviorism, or save the earth, it's the only planet with chocolate, or just things that are technological, like the windmills. And it wasn't changing the relationship with earth. Next slide, please. So I was quite intrigued to meet a group of people here in the Netherlands who were working on end ecocide. Polly Higgins was with us, and we started this idea of making a movie about end ecocide. In the end, we didn't make a movie, but Katie went on to actually make an organization, End Ecocide, or Stop Ecocide, which is still going strong today. And unfortunately, Polly is no longer with us. But I think that was the last time that I was really involved in a group on rights for Earth. And then climate justice started picking up pace, and that justice was bigger than rights. Next slide, please. Another development that happened, I skipped over, that was the Urgenda case, where an organization held the state accountable for their pollution and that they needed to lower. And I remember still being a co-plaintiff in that case. And that was also still thinking that justice was something that was happening in the courtroom. And more, I've been looking at other forms of justice. So I'll reflect a little bit on that. Next slide, please. So justice, one of the symbols for justice is like this scale, the two scales, and then often you see like a little globe on it, or you see here on the right a big, I don't know, boss or big leader, corporation, and the multitude, that it's not really balanced. And when I read the impact of enlightenment on our language, also our environmental language, I read that with the Enlightenment and science, there was this standardizing and quantification and mathematization of Earth, of nature. It also proposed flat space, linear time, and external nature. And 3, there was this metric system was a universal idiom, reducing reality to what could be counted. And it really hit me, like, this is another way of making justice something that is accounting, that is countable, and that is just a measurement. When it erodes the idea that it's not just about a ruler that measures, but it's a relationship that's on the line that has been harmed. And what about the relational dimensions of justice? When I see more and more NGOs using climate justice just for climate litigation, and when I see more and more of movement trying to get justice in a courtroom. So next slide, please. And this is when I encountered through a friend of mine, Wangui Wakamunji, more like a fan of justice, a fan as in different layers. And the go-to justice that we know is punitive justice, It's the justice that is done in states, and it is through punishments, and it looks mostly at who is guilty. Then we have distributive justice, which we see also in things like welfare, or like maybe a subsidy from the state for something. And here we see that inequality is somehow addressed. It's also in quota, but it doesn't really address it at the root cause. It just gives some crumbs to one side. So it again tips the scale a little bit, and it still comes from above. And then we have restorative justice, which is really about healing relationship in community. So not just looking at the victim or the perpetrator, but also the bystander, the neighbor, the father, the mother, the siblings of a particular injustice that took place. Here we can think of peacemaking in Indigenous law, or we can think of mediation sometimes in a conflict. And then there's generative justice, which we find in certain agricultural practices, like the old milpa system in Mexico, where you grow the squash and the squash, the beans, and the corn together, so they each kind of regenerate and help each other. So it's not fixing a problem, but it's generating good health and good relations. And it's not that not that I would propose that we need to get rid of punitive justice altogether. We need to stop certain harms so much, and our collective muscle and our collective imagination that we're in our climate justice struggle or in our earth protection have less articulation or campaigning skills in the Western world to deal with these other elements of justice making. Next slide, please. Here we see my friend Wangui Wakamonji, who is one of my teachers when it came to this chapter of my life. And we see here a power dynamics of where justice takes place. We see punitive justice happens at the side of nation states and bureaucracy. And if we look at Indigenous people around the world, we are oppressed by nation states and bureaucracy. They declare us extinct. They declare that the land is no longer, there are no longer land rights. So this is a hard place for us to seek justice. Distributive justice happens in the institutions, but often is only a band-aid. It doesn't address, like I said, like welfare. It doesn't create a maximum wage of $1 million a year. It allows for people to, like 8 men, to have more than 3.5 billion. So it just puts a band-aid on it. So I've become more and more interested in restorative justice, and then also how does restorative justice look like in a legal system. Next slide. And this is when I talked to my dear friend Chatileo Tranamil. She's one of the co-founders of Arales, a decolonial foundation that I also co-founded. And we talked about rights of nature, and she said, oh, that nature tokenism. And I laughed. And that was about a year ago. And I was like, wow, why am I laughing? This was a huge part of my, my activism in my life. Because I felt that I understood what she meant by the way that the emancipation of rights for nature is often imagined. That, oh, we're liberating nature because it was objectified, like it was a thing, and now it gets to have personhood and it gets to be a subject. Ooh. But as Indigenous people, we know that moving from being an object to a subject in a nation state means we're losing, because it means that we are no longer having our sovereignty. Our Indigenous laws are no longer valid. And it just means that we become a citizen in an oppressive state that colonized us. So the emancipation of object to subjectivity feels like diversity without decolonization, adding a pebble, but not even deeper system change. And so then I was thinking, what is beyond that? What is beyond from object to subject? And I came back to what I've heard many times from Indigenous people around the world. It's all about relations. So it's about like how to become a relative, how to see law and legal systems as a moral compass for how we want to have relations with our relatives. And I haven't figured that out yet, but I know that there are 5,000 Indigenous peoples around the world who are protecting 80% of biodiversity that have long-term experience with other laws, with other legal systems. And then I thought, it's kind of weird that often when I hear people talk about rights for nature, they will talk about the Maori in New Zealand and their role in fighting for the river getting rights, but we don't hear about their legal system. We only hear about them as a reference point and not as the central leadership point. So this is where I thought of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. It's a podcast online. And one of the speakers was talking about Africa and how Africa is often a reference point, but not the topic of discussion. Like, oh yeah, in Africa this happens. Where it's like, well, Africa is big, and can we have representation of the people themselves to talk about it more from a lived experience. Next slide, please. So there's still a lot going in my mind and in my heart and in my spirit, and I still haven't figured it out. So I'm really excited to talk to you today, also in our discussion about how this is then creating more and more skepsis with my Indigenous friends, saying like, oh, we have seen that in permaculture, permaculture is super lovely, but we've seen a lot of Indigenous knowledge appropriated, just like the pharma industry appropriated our medicinal knowledge. We see that the permaculture green movement has also whitewashed our stories without looking at our cosmovision, without looking at our more fundamental moral compass. They only take the bits that the shiny bits, and don't deal with the anti-oppression struggle. So a good source for that to learn more about the appropriative relationship of permaculture is the Whitewashed Hope article. We also have seen racist green NGOs like WWF who've, talked a great deal about conservation. That all sounds beautiful, but then they hire armed forces and chase Indigenous people of the land out in the name of conservation. And now we see whitewashed climate justice, where a movement that has, been around for a long time now gets kind of rebranded as climate litigation or rights of nature, where in most Indigenous language, there's not a word for nature. There is a word for earth and there's a word for the land, but there's no such thing as an external nature that we are somehow not a part of. It's very Western to think of our body as biology and the land as geography. That is a lineage of Western science of alienation. So that's a lot. And I was just looking at different things that I look like. If I go on YouTube now, there are some talks where Indigenous people talk about rights for Mother Earth, or sometimes they'll even use the frame of rights for nature. But I often see rights of nature also whitewashed through an individual story of like, ooh, I was only doing human rights and now I am enlightened because nature is no longer object but subject. Or even one talk, and to be fair, this was a young girl and she hardly had any followers, but she talks about rights of nature as a matter of biodiversity protection, which in the end serves human life and businesses. So we see the erosion of the scope of a moral compass, which in the end a legal system is. It's a moral compass for society, isn't founded any longer on indigenous cultures and experiences of traditional ecological knowledge. Next slide, please. So here are some of the books that have helped me gain these insights and questions. On the top, we see Indigenous books. On the bottom, we see a book by a white ally, I would say, to really understand the impact of enlightenment here on our concept of nature. And Theorie van de Kraal on our concept of being so separate, and instead of being a proliferation of life, a web of life. And those, I think, are really helpful tools to see how white allies can be in the fight. We don't all need to be indigenous. We all have a role to play in protecting the web of life. And I think Deep Medicine and Anatomy of Justice is a good place to drive it home. I want to share a little thing from the book, which kind of drives home with how weird it is to separate nature and humans, that you really need a Western mind for that to even make that separation. So it talks about that microbes, bacteria, it's on health justice, so it's environmental justice and the health industry, or Western science. Microbes, bacteria, archaea, protozoa, fungi, and viruses are the most successful organisms on this planet. In sheer number, longevity, and adaptability, no other creature holds a candle to them. By the time mammals showed up, microbes were already over 3 billion years old. The human microbiota, the community of microbes who live on and inside us, comprises nearly 2,000 different kinds of organisms. We host to trillions of microbes who, together with the specific niches they inhabit, make up the human microbiome. Skip part. Humans have only 20,000 protein encoding genes, about the same number as fruit flies. All the life on or in our bodies contains at least 20 million genes. And this goes on to kind of give the medical perspective of how much the human body is not even human. That we are more microbes, and we are 2,000 different organisms. We are a constellation. We are like a star constellation in the universe, only this micro version of it. And so I am looking for both language and practices, and we will do an exercise around language and practices that are grounded in the understanding of the deforestation that happens in the world also happens within ourselves. And the erosion of land also happens within our health and our imagination of legal systems. So I'm looking for legal strategies that are actually not using Indigenous as a reference point, but actually using the vast experience and legal systems of Indigenous peoples around the world to base the struggle for a legal system change. Let's see, that's, yeah, my final quote of this book is, and this is just a very random little part of the book. The book is really beautiful and wholesome, and I think very indicative of how health justice is encompassing both human and planetary dimensions. Your gut microbiome is as unique as your fingerprints. Even identical twins whose host genome is 99.9% similar can have gut microbes that are 80 to 90% different. This is the poetry of the web of life. What makes you unique is the multitude of beings that make your body their home. I love this final sentence, I'll repeat. What makes you unique is the multitude of beings that make your body their home. And yeah, this is about protecting our home, both, yeah, not even both, but on all dimensions. And I feel like we've eroded through our language of turning the rights for Mother Earth to rights for nature. We've eroded a spiritual and relational dimension. And I think we are every time getting caught up in that we haven't reckoned with enlightenment and how enlightenment has created a lot of fiction, biological fiction, cultural fiction that is very toxic. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is actually where we get to a creative part, but before we go to the creative part, I will open it up for questions to see how this is landing and what kind of questions might arise, because this is just a work in progress reflection on a movement that is also coming into being. See a hand.
Yeah, though I believe Bianca already wrote a question in the chat before me. Should I just read it out perhaps?
Sure.
So Bianca said, a question for the end. Would it be better to recognize rights of nature in countries or areas where there are no indigenous people? So I guess making a distinction between the colonizing countries and the colonized countries when talking about if it makes sense to take this approach.
I think this is already skipping to something further in the talk about borders and boundaries. And I think we have been taught to think in borders. Also, when we think about the world and parts of the world. And I think one of the fundamental teachings of Indigenous way of life is that there are no borders on an Indigenous map. If you go to Native Land or Native Maps website, you see all the Indigenous people on their territory around the world. And you see a lot of overlap. You see like this land is this and that and that and that. And what that shows to me is a lot of coexistence. And in Dutch, we have a name for society and we call it together living. And I think we don't do an awful lot of together living. So I wouldn't necessarily think that we want to divide it up even more of like do rights of nature here and rights of Mother Earth there, because I still think it's one Mother Earth or a multitude of beings that are both on a planetary level and on a individual level. I think what we're looking for is, well, one, in our legal fights, to broaden the scope of our understanding of life. And what I mean by that is I recently looked to a talk on Micmac legal system or legal understanding at a law university guest lecture. And the speaker, I think his name was Sakej Henderson, a Mi'kmaq teacher in law. He was talking about their understanding of, in their language, of inclusive collective spirits. Now, I may be partially Indigenous, but I cannot translate that into any Dutch language or English language or Spanish language for that matter. The words that have inclusive collective spirits. So we might think of a forest that has inclusive collective spirits, right? Like we know that if you deforest a forest to a certain degree, there's a tipping point, and the die-off kind of is a feedback loop that increases. You cannot explain that if there were all individual trees. You can only explain it if you understand it as a inclusive collective spirit that is also dying off. I think we have to reckon with the whole coloniality of our legal systems that are based on property law of a colonial era. So that's skipping ahead to maybe where we're going later is like, can we eliminate property law? If we want to have a radical legal intervention.
Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, I was going to ask my questions too, if that's okay. I think it matches really beautifully with what you just said. I was just wondering if you could expand on what you said with when we talk about legal systems to not use indigeneity as a reference point, but as a foundation of some sort. And if you can maybe elaborate a bit on what you mean with using it as a reference point, and yeah, if you can expand a little bit on this statement in general.
Yes. I think when I hear people talk about the history of rights for nature, they will often reference Ecuador as the first country to have a grondwet, a constitution, which rights of nature are part of. Bolivia will get referenced. So that will be a sentence or maybe two. But then we don't spend the time on like, what about the movements that fought for that to happen? What is their cosmovision? What is their origin story? What is their ideas of our purpose on earth? And can that be a leading or guiding teaching to implement this legal system change? If not, are we not just doing cherry picking, using some shiny elements of the proposal to have rights from Mother Earth that comes from a long lineage of indigenous movements, but then trying to implement it into a system which is fundamentally based on property rights, the Western system. Yeah.
So if we implement it all in a cosmo vision, it could still be useful maybe if we connect to the long-term purpose of using rights. Is that what you're saying?
Sorry, can you repeat? Because I just saw another question in the chat and I missed part of what you said.
I just had a clarifying question. If you said if we are consciously connected to a cosmovision, then rights can for some time be used to undo structures like colonial structures.
I'm not against rights. I do think rights are part of a constellation of tools in a legal system. And we need to build up, on the one hand, the tools that protect, which could be through rights, and on the other hand, build up the tools to stop harm. And then we need to build up the tools for relational transformation, because even if you stop harm and you build up rights, we have a lot of collective trauma where nobody trusts each other, and oppressed beings with good reason not to trust. So if we want to really heal, then there's both an element of stopping harm, there's an element of protecting, maybe through rights, and an element of kind of planet therapy or group therapy, to say it in a funny way.
Thank you. No, that's really clear. It's interesting to see how different people have different opinions on rights in this background.
Yeah.
Some more questions. Debbie asked, could you expand more on the statement you mentioned, justice being bigger than rights?
Thank you. Let me think for a moment. I think justice is a practice. I have an example later on that I think is one of the most inspiring justice practice moments that I've seen in my life. And it was during Standing Rock, when there was veteran military people who came to the Indigenous camp fighting against a pipeline, to protect them from military harm. So you have veterans being a shield against harm, and then they engaged in an apology ceremony where they got onto their knees and actually apologized for all the harm that has been done through the US military that they were a part of. And every time when I see that video, I cry. And even if I talk about it, I cry, because there's such a humbling and reframing dimension in that practice that it alters relationship. I think that is justice making, that is peacemaking. Justice serves peace. And that doesn't just happen in some institute related to the state. Often, more than anything, it happens when you resolve a fight with your neighbor, or in this case, a fight that has been ongoing for 500 years on Indigenous land in the US territory. So I like the idea of justice as a practice and not as an outcome.
Thank you. Makes a lot of sense. Then we have another question from Bianca. Bianca said, I noticed you say rights for nature, not of nature. Can you expand on your thoughts on the usage of rights to, on, for? Do you consciously choose for nature?
I love that question because I love language. I must say I haven't really thought about it. It's just how I've encountered it mostly, rights for Mother Earth. That's how the books and everything talked about it. So that's how I kind of adopted it. I wouldn't know what rights on nature are. I'd be happy to hear from somebody about that, actually. Rights to nature. I think I still need to
I think Bianca meant off.
Sorry?
Bianca wrote that I think she meant of nature instead
Okay. Of nature. Yeah, I don't understand nature, so then it's really hard to understand how a concept that has been created to otherize the web of life I do understand that the rights are innate. I think we agree with each other there. At the same time, I also think that rights are a very human way of mediating problems. It's not necessarily the way that trees would mediate a problem, I think. But you would have to ask the tree. Yeah, let me think about that a little bit more. And happy to hear also if you have something to contribute to that, like please unmute yourself, and very happy for this to be a conversation and not just a monologue.
I personally think rights for or to nature does point out maybe linguistically more that the human construction of rights in itself, and exactly that's not an innate thing to nature.
I think that the dignity is innate, the dignity of it, of not it, of them, of her, of them, the dignity of the web of life is innate. To a degree, rights are part of our human invention of structuring life. Yeah, but this is a good bridge to actually open it up to think about language more widely, and not just by me, but by all of us, because we're all meaning creating beings, and we all have a history of being on this earth and learning of the earth, of her, of them. So maybe we can go back to the slides just for a moment. And we see, I wanted it to be a reflection of if we can think about language and language that erases within our environmental movement. So for me, that's nature. For me, that erases the relationality of all of life, and how in many indigenous cultures, in different words, we say the web of life, of which humans are a humble part of, and within humanity, or in a human, having another 2,000 species that live within us. So for me, it erases the 2,000 beings that live inside me and make me into an individual, a singular being. I also have like trouble with innovation. Like often this rights to nature, rights for nature is seen as a new thing. And that erases the history of many legal systems that were there before colonization, that had different ways of granting certain responsibilities, duties, or rituals related to different rivers, lands, trees, beings, animals. So for me, innovation is often a word used that erases. And I wanted to invite you all to think for a moment, if you can think of words that you encounter in your academia, in your activism, in your curiosity for Earth defending, that might erase other beings, other organisms, or erase other histories or other understandings. So I would like to just play a song, and in this time you can either walk around in the room or just take a sip of your drink, or think about language and environmental language. And if you can think of something, and please put it in the chat at the end of the song.
What song would you like me to play?
The Renata Flores one.
Yes.
So this is not the break moment, but this is just for the song, right?
Yeah.
Un día soy importante y luego arden llamas. Kaya ikipi, ay kaipi ay chanki. Chihap chay waita, chihap chay waita. Lamentarás lo que hiciste, mananyam ga. Chanki chuhatur, kiri hampita, kanya kuchkapi. Kausari kuring supai warahina. No sé si llover o granizar. Cálmame, Oaxaca nichu, Pachamama Cani. Dicen que mi existencia está en peligro. Te convertiste en tu peor enemigo. Al día siguiente tu mente borraste. Te pedí a gritos que puedas salvarme. Lamentarás lo que hiciste, mananyamga, chankichuhatur, kirihampita, kanyakuchkapi. Kausari kuring supai warahina. No sé si llover o granizar. Cálmame, Oaxaca nichu, Pachamama Cani.
It's a song by Renata Flores. She's Quechua from Peru, and she writes in her indigenous language. And this is a song in which she sings that she is the Mother Earth. So it's like a love song or a heartbreak song from the point of view as Mother Earth. Does anybody want to speak to their word and reflect a little bit in the group?
I think I was the first one, so I can go. I put save because I think it's a word that gets thrown around a lot in the environmental movement, this idea of like, we need to save the planet. And I feel like it's very, it kind of fits into the same framework of like, that we have the power to save nature slash the, however you phrase it, the web of life. And I think it's very disempowering on the other side. And it's also, yeah, it reminds me again of like this kind of man-woman dynamic as well, where the woman is classically being saved all the time. So I think that kind of, yeah, that's what brought it to my head.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. I see quite a few others. Are there more people who would love to share their reflection?
Yeah, I can talk about the animal models one, because I'm studying life sciences, and every time that for example mice are used for an experiment, they're not referred to as beings but as animal models, models for human diseases, but just in a different organism that we can handle under different ethical standards. And for me it's always so I know, really upsetting actually to hear this term being thrown around, because it's the type of language that allows us or enables us to distance ourselves from other beings. And I think it's an example where language is a very powerful upholder of ideas, or creator of ideas, maybe even.
Yeah, it frames both the problem and the solution. So if the language frames a problem or solution in a distorted way, we're going to have distorted processes, and we're going to continue harm often. Thank you for sharing. Maybe one more person who wants to share?
I said biodiversity stocks because I study like environmental law and policy, and we're always hearing like, okay, we need to restore or protect like biodiversity, and how do we measure it? Like we push and hide away like all of these like living beings and like even the soil and everything like that into just like this numerical obscure term of like a stock. So I also kind of exactly actually I never thought of that. And yeah, I kind of recognize that when you said that in the Enlightenment they like we turned nature into like mathematical, or yeah, I don't know the word you said exactly, but something like that. And I also recognize that in the language that we hear in restoration policy.
It's from this book,
Yes.
The Web of Life, that yeah, it's quite poetic and very astute, putting the finger on the sore point. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that must be horrible. It's like, how much disrespect can you contain in a word by eliminating, a life to a stock or a crop, which we also often hear, like chickens as a crop that can be harvested after 42 days, like it eliminates the life and the life value and the life dignity out of a being that is massively exploited and oppressed. Yeah. I think on that note, we need a little break. So we'll have a 5-minute break. And I would like to invite you now, when you actually take your break, to keep thinking about language, and thinking about language that is relational. Do you know any language in which it includes some kind of relational understanding? So that's something to think about while we'll take a moment, 5 minutes, to replenish.
Thank you. So we'll be back at 4:20 Central European time.
What kind of words we can think of that are relational in regard to our environmental work or inquiry? And I see here already a few coming up: synergy, connection, reciprocity, love, kinship, ecology. Keep them coming. Care. I love care. I got stuck on the previous exercise still. Good, yeah.
I just kept coming up with more words like that instead.
Yeah, I can imagine. And these exercises aren't really good to do in 5 minutes either, but since we're online, it's also not nice to drag it out. The view of nature, like from a bird's view. Tend, diversity. Cool. If there's anybody who would like to speak to their word or their experience of the exercise, be happy to hear back. But we can also let it simmer, and I can tell you something about a word that I would like to share with you. Maybe you can put back the slides. So one word that I wanted to share, that's the next one.
Chihiro, I can actually, I think, give you remote control and then you can try. I think you should be able to click through the slides yourself.
That sounds nice. But,
Yeah.
oh, yay.
Right.
Yeah, it does work.
Perfect.
Amazing. Oh, it's sensitive. I hope it comes back. It doesn't go back.
Let me try. I just use like the arrows on my keyboard and that should do the job.
Yeah. Okay, so here we see Suma Kamanya, and I don't know, you may have encountered it before. It's also said as Suma Kausai, the good life. And I will read a little bit about what this really means. It doesn't just mean good life. I think one important element of good life is that it rejects better life, because better life implies at the expense of somebody else. So it creates a whole other purpose to aim for good and not for better. I'm going to tell about 2 or 3 ways Kamanya can be used. For example, one of the things they also say is Kamanya is a warm and well-protected place built with a collection of stones. From the diverse angles of the shelter, a person can calmly guard their livestock. Livestock, another word. It's almost like an image of what our world has to do. A kamanya is a calm and restful place from which we can graze and protect the entire herd. In one way, the herd is all of humanity. This is kamanya. Another is called kamawi. Besides meaning a dwelling, kamawi also means the meeting of people who are used to coming together to converse and pass the time in a friendly way. This is the way in which we have to live in this home. This is the indispensable condition in the communal house we're talking about here. It is necessary to live with ourselves. Now I'll tell you about the third kamasa, meaning kamasa. Kamasa is character. This third kamasa means way of being, value, audacity, vitality, courage, and energy. We learned this kamasa from the cosmos and Mother Earth. I remember that one time there was an eclipse here. Everyone watching through their hands was another form of kamasa. The word kamiri is a transformation of kamasa, which you here in Bolivia know because it is the place. Some will say it is where you find oil, but there was someone who said that Kamir is rich because they had oil. Kamiri is Kamiri. The Paraguayans know it very well as a small forest, but when they say Kamari are the rich, they aren't thinking about the rich or the very wealthy or those who are full of money. It is those who know Kamar. Kamanyar means who do well with everyone. Kamari is able to share in his abundance with everyone and celebrate it because everyone is together and content. This reminds me of a time I wrote about this, and someone wrote to me and asked, how then do you say poor? The word poor is curious because it doesn't mean that a person has absolutely nothing. It only means that he doesn't have money. They say vakcha, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it well. Vakcha is the opposite of kamari. The literal translation of vakcha is little orphan. I remember in my community there was a 70-year-old man who used to come all the time to ask for something. He used to say that he was a little orphan, and every time would laugh because were he alive, his father would have been 112 years old. So kamanya means living together in a house for everyone. So this is a huge story just about one word, Kamanya. And each time I learn one word in my Indigenous language, I don't just learn a word, I learn different life philosophy of like, what is our purpose here? So I really wanted to share that with you. And yeah, I wish I could share the book, but it's not something you can buy in the shop. Let me just see if I can click through.
If it doesn't work, just let me know and then I'll keep doing it.
Yeah, maybe you keep doing it because maybe it's just a delay, but so I just shared a word from a Quechua language, which is both found in Bolivia, Peru, part of Ecuador, part of Chile, and part of Argentina. And I was earlier referencing that I think we need to go from borders to boundaries. Borders divide, and boundaries are just a way of respecting respecting ability or maximum capacity or minimum input or things that are relational and not necessarily divisive. At least this is how I have come to understand it. And I find it quite horrible that in my own language, Dutch, there's only one word, grenzen. And we use it both for nation state borders as well as for boundaries. And I think we need way more words, a proliferation of words that actually understand the nuance between respect for maximum, not maximum, optimal engagement, respect for optimal engagement and division, and that they're not the same. Can I get the next slide? So why we're going very big here, right? Because we're talking about rights for Earth and rights for nature, and we end up talking really about why are we on Earth? What is our purpose? What is our life philosophy on what we're doing here? And we're ending with relational understanding of how can relational language then lead to relational campaigning. So I will give a few more thoughts on why relational campaigning is so important in our environmental work. And one person I'd like to quote is Jennifer Bailey, who says, social change moves at the speed of relationships, and relationships move at the speed of trust. And I've seen so much movement work getting stuck or getting fractured because of relational divides, because of not having the trust to actually do very scary anti-oppression work. Because when we really rise to the occasion and challenge oppression, we meet a lot of violence, you know, like those who have been on the front lines for an occupation of a mine know how the police behave with our bodies. They just trespass our bodies like they trespass the land. So to engage in this earth defending, it's imperative that we have strong relations of trust with the people that we build movement with, but also with the people that we want to build allyship with. Next slide, please. So I should say that my theory of change is relationship. It's radical friendship. It's building more trust to do more anti-oppression work. And it sits within an understanding of that our environmental work is reparative justice. We don't want to save a world and save a future. We want to repair the damage that is already done through better relationships from this moment on. And reparations, as Queen Mother Ya Asantaba Ohema says, reparations is a process, not a paycheck. So this is ongoing. This is the work of the next 500 years. And here it's also good to know that there have been people studying economy that have looked at the monetary element of reparations, and they've come to an understanding that it would be somewhere between 112 and 448 trillion US dollars in terms of monetary repair that was needed at that time when the calculation was made. But the best way to repair that, the fastest way to repair that, is to shatter inequality, to repair all relations. That would be the fastest way to repair the harm that we now see and live in. Next slide, please. So transforming relations, it's not a techno fix. Relational work is not techno fix. I do really appreciate the work of Edgar Villanueva, who wrote Decolonizing Wealth. And the second half of the book really goes through how you do this on the institutional level. So if you are a foundation or if you are a fund, then this book can really help you to do relational transformative work when you power. So a fund might have a lot of old wealth from rich people, and it might want to aim reducing harm against environment or oppressed people. So how do you deal with that power imbalance there? And he goes through these 7 steps, which seem pretty easy and kind of no-brainers. But then if you look at NGOs and our environmental movement, we see that we often skip fundamental phases, and we go, instead of starting with grief and actually allowing the body to feel the loss. Like I started this workshop saying, I hope you stay in contact with your gut. So if something hurts, I hope you will breathe to wherever it hurts and sit with it for a longer time, to actually allow yourself to grieve, to allow your emotional intelligence to come through. But often we want to skip that, go to a workshop, do some visibility or diversity, and then we appropriate some knowledge because we're so dedicated to be fast, instead of to be relational and actually build our relations. Next slide, please. So earlier I talked about restorative justice. This was going to be the example I wanted to give of veterans coming to Standing Rock to go through ceremony and through apology, through grieving, through restoring relations. And you might wonder, yeah, that's very nice on the interpersonal level, but we also have forest fires, deforestation, all these things. We need the big legal system change, which I totally agree with. And so I'm not against this legal strategy. I just think that legal strategy also needs to be informed by the restorative justice work, which includes not appropriating knowledge, but being in a fuller relationship with those who have had other legal concepts that have protected the earth for millennia. So I hope that proposition is clear, because we're going through a big range of philosophical, legal, movement, relational dimensions of the topic. So when it comes to campaigning, I think there are 5 dysfunctions of a team that we can often identify when things aren't going so well. And at the bottom of the base, again, is the absence of trust. And we live in a world where there's an absence of trust because we've regulated all our relationships through an exploitative dimension of gain and profit and growth. And we all know that if the privatized element grows, then the commons shrink. So there's an exploitative and harmful dynamic within all of our relational of each other. Of course, you may have some friends with whom you're in good, trusting relationships with, but that's we need to upscale that to a very big degree, I think. Next slide, please. So here's my radical thought, because you may think, okay, this is a lot of critique and complexity. What is it that I think would be the most helpful at this day and age as to decolonize a legal system? And I do think we want rights. We want rights for beings that are non-human. So this is an additive, but I think the most fundamental thing is that we actually eliminate this colonial practice of property rights, of turning everything into property. And we see it in the anti-racism movement, who are calling for abolish the police. This abolition element of our movement, we're missing it in the environmental movement sometimes, our articulation of abolition. We might want to abolish fossil fuels, but that's way too limited. That's still the symptom. It's just one tiny industry. Well, it's a big industry, but it's one industry in a whole set of extractive industries and legal systems, because most of our legal system is based on property, and that's a colonial invention. We know that humanity has lived as nomads for 90% of our history. And even when we settled, the land still belonged to itself for most of the time. So that land, that crops, that knowledge is intellectual property or physical property, is a very colonial and new concept. It's the appropriation of everything, of other lives. And we see it even literally in the United States, where they carved on sacred hills the faces of racist presidents. In the Black Hills, there are indigenous people fighting for those hills to come back into their stewardship, and you know, yeah. But we see the scarring of that property law. So I do think there's an element of punitive justice that needs to happen, or an element of kind of reducing harm. It's not enough to do good with respecting rights. I also think we really need an element of a legal system change that is the elimination of property as we know it right now. Because as long as property is really in the line of slavery, is really in the line of not being relational with something, but dividing the world in the possessive ones and the possessions. And as long as water is a possession and not sovereign, then it can have rights, but it will still get violated. That's my thoughts. Next slide, please, because we're going to end with a final exercise. This is just a tiny little embodiment of mixing play, punitive justice, restorative justice, all up in one. With the Decolonial Foundation Adeles, we have Indigenous Liberation Day. And last year we made a court tribunal, like just an enactments of colonizers. And we have piñatas, which are like these papier-mâché bowls with normally candies in it, but we put seeds in it. And the kids, the indigenous kids, would get a bat and they could bash the colonizer, Yepekun, Columbus, Shell, and Unilever. And it turned into group therapy because everybody got so excited and it was playful. So it transformed relationships. It didn't transform the legal system. But this is how we do justice in practice. We practice on a small scale so we can upscale from the grassroots to the institutions, from the institutions to the state, to a point where we can actually eliminate nation states and reform that. But if it doesn't come from below, it often ends up being appropriative again. Then we go to the exercise of campaigning, which I'm so I don't even know how to do it, but I'm so excited about it. So I don't know who in this room considers themselves to be an activist, but as an activist, you will at some point get introduced into the STAR tactic exercise. Well, you draw a star and you think of your campaign through messaging, the tone, the timing, the audience, the allies, the resources, the target. And it's a very helpful exercise, but I've also felt like it has reduced some of our aims, mostly the relational aims. It's again a very linear way of campaigning. And so for this workshop today, I've thought of like some alternative questions we might want to ask ourselves before we engage in a campaign, whether that's a legal campaign or a communication campaign or an academic campaign or an occupation street campaign. And it's for you and your collective to think through these questions. Who do you miss? Who do you long for? Where is your grief felt? Where is your grief transformed? And how collective do you feel? And I want to preferably not explain them and just have a little bit of an exercise. If you intuitively answer these questions, it doesn't have to be right. It doesn't have to be good. There's a philosophical and poetic element to it that might feel not so practical as the star symbol, but I wonder what will come up, bubble up. And then I will say a few words about why these questions, or what I think these questions would help us clarify in our work. So yeah, I'm gonna give you some time. We're living now 1:45, maybe 8 minutes or so to just do a brain dump, like whatever pours out, put pen to paper and just write, even if it's just, I don't know what to write.
Okay.
And have fun. So I'd love to hear if there's anybody who would want to share anything of what just came up. You can just unmute yourself. This part will be cut out of the YouTube video that is posted online, so feel free to share a half thought or a half question. Doesn't have to be anything finished. Just very curious to hear what came up. Yeah, I think I'm gonna be using this for future projects that I will do to just check in, both with myself and with the people that I work with. What are some of our relational goals? Because we often just make physical goals or theoretical goals, meaning pertaining to ideas, consciousness, or to physical implementation. And this is, again, in Indigenous medicine wheel, you have 4 parts. And there's a part that is the physical, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual. And together that makes us a being. And we believe that every being has those 4 elements. And just like I was sharing earlier about justice, and not just looking at punitive justice, but also looking at restorative justice and generative justice that is more embedded in community, I think the spiritual and the emotional part of our environmental change work, is in changing our protection or the rights that environment has in the world, is missing an element of the spiritual and emotional. And this is how we've seen that rights for Mother Earth has been changed to rights of nature, because that's more the domain that academia can handle or the legal system can handle. The idea that we are protecting our mother is still somehow primitive or too spiritual, too hippie. So who do you miss? I think it can help us in campaigns to get a sense of who our elders are, where we draw wisdom from, and who our allies are. So I might miss my ancestors, who I never got to know, not in person or through books and history. Or I might miss, actually, as I was, looking for other people to fill this in, I was missing the worms. I remember that I did some gardening once, and there was a worm kind of compost, and you had to work with the worms to get them out of the earth so they could be in a particular part where they could do their work and their magic. The worms are so amazing for the soil, and I was just thinking, like, I'm doing some gardening now, but there are no worms, and I wish, I missed them. So that kind of is a reminder of like things that I'm not holding in my practice normally, but I miss them, and it helps me to remember who I'm doing it for as well, or who I'm doing it with, or who I'm doing it informed by. Who do you long for? Again, this can set relational goals. Do you long for a connection with certain people? I've often found in anti-racism work that NGOs will want to do something for, let's say, a Black community or a Latino community, but if you go to their birthday or to their office, there's only white people there. So they're not really missing the Latino people or the Indigenous people or the Black people. They just have it as a goal, like a technical goal to fix something, but it's not relational, as in they're not missing them in their life to see that they might hold internal intrinsic knowledge or values, or where is your grief transformed? This can be really an understanding of power mapping, of your relational technology, your tools and your facilities, the organizational strength of where you can inspire, because transforming grief is profound. So if you can do that somewhere, or if you know how to do that in some way, that can be a huge asset for your building relations. How collective do you feel? Understanding your skills and sensitivities, spiritual and material belongings and needs. This is a whole other dimension of our campaigning that we often leave untapped, but that creates or allows for big divisions to linger and actually get worse. We talked a lot about appropriation. When we skip on this element of the work, the distrust for that appropriation only grows stronger and stronger. So I have the last slide is with a few tips for campaigning. There are 6 kind of ways to operationalize some of the knowledge I've been sharing. When you campaign, have historical understanding of the element you're campaigning on. So in case of Rights for Earth, have historical understanding, not just of the last 20 years, but the last 500 years or thousands of years of the legal systems of those that have suffered under colonialism. Considering your positionality and your power relationship with the web of life. Taking more time for onboarding stakeholders. So what that means, again, in NGOs or in also in academia, you'll have a certain time, and you'll have like, you need to write 4,000 words, or you need to have 70,000 email addresses, but there's no time to drink coffee with people who have been hurt by this system. There's a way of value or disvaluing life. Setting up relational goals, political goals. So it's not just rhetoric and theory, but it actually needs to keep more bodies safe, and a willingness to overcome more oppression pain. Again, this speaks to not just being opportunistic, but being principled to work with the life forces that are least sexy, that are least appealing to a mass public. Because when we can build solidarity around that and those life forms, we build to last. We build foundational shifting relationships. Ja, I think that was mostly what I had to share. I think we're also running out of time. Speaking of relations, I have a final slide where there's some tips for staying in touch. I can also drop that in the chat. Through Arales. And this is that the land back is not just frivolous campaigning, but it's or theory, but it's what Indigenous people are calling for. And so rights from Mother Earth goes hand in hand with land back. And these are some ways to stay in touch, not just with me individually, but also with other people who are doing this decolonial work. With Arales, and the 12th of October, we're doing Indigenous Liberation here in Amsterdam. So if you are based in the Netherlands, you're very much invited to connect and relate.